Hello, I'm Robert, and this time I'm going to talk about the next of these legends, the urban legends, the idea that everything is horrible, that all the effects of karma are just absolutely horrible, and even when they seem wonderful, they really are horrible, or you should see them as being horrible. So this is an idea that we have in the West somewhat. The idea is a sort of a sense that you should be miserable, that even when you're very happy, that somehow you don't deserve to be happy and you should be miserable. But we don't have that at all in Buddhism. So in the Buddhist teaching, then absolutely you can have times when you're really very, very happy. And what's more, the Buddha himself, he explored this before he became enlightened. And so you can have a very happy life, that like the life that the Buddha had when he was growing up, indeed. When he was in the palace and all his wishes were fulfilled and just everything was just absolutely wonderful. And so you can have times like that. And then after that, he started looking for it to try and find a way out of the situation, not just for himself but for everyone. He looked at this and he discovered that there's certain things that were unsatisfactory about the conditioned existence. So he went to these various teachers, and sure you know the story of the life of the Buddha, about how he first of all saw someone who was sick, and someone who was old, and someone who was dying, and then he saw this hermit who showed him that there's this path that you can follow to try and not as kind of being a prince and a king and so on, but there's this other kind of path that you can follow. And so that kind of story of the Buddha's life story as it's presented traditionally. Anyway, whatever the actual details of actually happened, then he ended up trying to find a kind of true happiness and true solution to all his problems, and for himself, and then to help other beings in the same way. And so he went around the various people who were teaching in those times, and they're teaching various forms of meditation. And he was thinking at one point that this would be the solution to the problems, that if you can find the right way of meditating, then maybe that can solve everything. And so he did actually manage to enter these states of mind where, and he turned out he was a kind of natural at meditating. So that's maybe something that's coming from his previous lives, so that's might be actually karma in action, as we'll see a little bit later as to how people think about that. But so anyway, so he went to various teachers of his time, and he mastered these very subtle states that you can enter in meditation, where there's absolutely no trace of any problems at all. So the various kinds of states like that. There's the state of absolutely pure bliss, where there's no suffering at all. Everything's just pleasant. And to this day, then meditators report, the meditators who go and meditate for years in caves, and they say that you can encounter these states like that to this day, where you're just sitting in just blissed out completely. And then so he found that, but then he said, oh, yeah, that's obviously not a solution. That's just being intoxicated. And so he went to very refined states, where his mind was very clear, and there was not being pulled by pain or pleasure, a state of pure equanimity, and even more refined states, very, very refined states of the mind, where there's absolutely no trace of any problems, any unsatisfactoriness at all. Very clear, calm mind. And so when you're in these states, all your problems have been solved. It's like a state of mind in which if you can imagine that, say, just suddenly all your problems were solved, and everything that's been bothering you was no longer bothering you, then there's states of minds like that. And so you would think, oh, well, I've reached the end of the path. And people who enter those states of mind, they might think, oh, I've reached nirvana, because everything does seem that you've had all your problems solved. But these teachers, they took the last of them, which was the most refined one, and the teacher said, oh, you've mastered this so thoroughly, can you take over from the teaching, if I remember the story right. But the Buddha, he said, well, he had reached a state in which it seems that all his problems have been solved. But he then said, but he could see that this is dependent, that actually the state of mind that he'd gone into is a dependent state, because he needed to be actually in his physical body, for instance, in order to be in this meditative state. So it's all very well to enter a state of mind in which all your problems are solved, but you've still got this human body, and at some point that's going to die. So is this state of mind that you've entered, is that going to continue through your next life, and your next life, and your next life? It's going to continue through all future time. And it seems reasonably possible that it mightn't. And so the Buddha, he looked at that and he said, well, okay, yes, it does seem that all my problems have been solved, but I'm not convinced at all that this is the end of my search, because of this state of meditation I've entered into is dependent on conditions. And so that's why he went on searching after that point. So when the Buddha teaches that everything is dukkha, then what he's saying is not that everything is unsatisfactory. Not in that sense. So even unsatisfactoriness is a poor translation, because you get these very satisfactory states of mind in samsara, where everything is wonderful and all your problems are solved. And really, I think it would be a very poor translation to call that an unsatisfactory state of mind. So he's not saying that at all. So there's the dukkha of dukkha, which is the dukkha of suffering, but you also have the dukkha, this dukkha, which is simply that everything's, that it's sort of saying this hasn't solved everything. It seems that all my problems are solved, you have the feeling that all your problems are solved, but actually on sober reflection then they haven't really been completely solved. Not completely, not totally. And that is what, when he says everything's dukkha, then that's what he means by that. So there's no sense at all there that there's, when you're in these states of mind, they're actually good. And if meditators enter states of bliss, then they don't try and sort of say, oh, well, I must start feeling miserable again. There's something wrong with feeling bliss in meditation. It's actually good to feel bliss in meditation. It's kind of good and healthy. It means you're, in a good state of mind. Your mind is very clear, and it's ready to do all sorts of various things that you can think very clearly or follow your meditation instructions or whatever it is very easily, because this state of bliss has arisen. And in our ordinary life, then if we are in a very happy state of mind, then it's a great time for accomplishing things and doing all lots of things, and you can think very clearly, you can solve very complicated problems, or you can do all sorts of stuff because you're very, very happy. And if it goes over the top, you can get intoxicated by that, then obviously that's a bit of a problem. But it's just being very happy and all your problems solved, at least for the time being, that can be a good state to be in. So they're both good. So if you're very happy also, that's a good time for loving kindness and for helping others and appreciating the happiness of others, and sympathetic joy, where you because you're very happy yourself, it's very easy to look at other people who are happy and think, oh, how great that they're happy. You don't have any problems with that idea because you're so happy yourself. So it's a great time to kind of sympathize with the joy of other people, and to also try to look at ways of trying to help people who aren't happy to find happiness, this kind of loving kindness. And then it's also times when you're suffering, and a good time to look at the sufferings of other people and experience that the suffering that I'm experiencing right now. Then it's in this body, everyone has these bodies that are very fragile and that are susceptible to suffering, and you can experience that other people and people who are actually suffering, and others that you experience have the potential for suffering. So even though they don't know it, that they have this potential for suffering, though they don't reflect on it much. Then so you can do both. So there's and being happy is absolutely fine. And so you don't have at all in Buddhism the idea that we've got to be miserable. It's just not there at all. It's just not present. Or that you deserve, and because you deserve it, you should be miserable. As I said before, we don't deserve anything. So it's all coming from this confusion, which we keep coming back to. This confusion that is not even a willful confusion. So that's where it originates from. And it's absolutely fine to be happy. So if you're going through a great time, then don't but it's a time for a little bit of sober reflection, and just saying, okay, just recognizing that, okay, I'm very happy just now, this happiness is not going to last because it's dependent on conditions. And at some point, maybe in the distant future, then maybe it's not going to last, and I'm no longer in a situation where all my problems are solved. So a little bit of thinking, well, what do I do next? And that's all the teaching everything is dukkha is about. And so not at all that you have to think that you're unhappy, that you have to make yourself unhappy or suffering. That's how counterproductive. So now we go to the next one, which is that the idea that karma is physics. So this is very easy to get into this because you start talking about cause and effect. But if you think about it, it's rather anachronistic, because the idea of physics is something that has risen really fully, really in the last few centuries. And back at the time of the Buddha, there was just the very beginnings of mathematics and the very beginnings of something that would eventually evolve into a kind of scientific way of thinking. But there weren't any scientists back then, not as we understand it just now. And even rather later, the likes of Archimedes, I'm not sure he's really counted as a modern scientist. He's a great mathematician, and he did something that could be regarded as a kind of proto-science, maybe. But I think you have to go to the times of, say, Galileo and Newton and people like that to get the idea that you're actually looking for laws of physics and doing experiments and trying to work out what those laws are. So the idea that you might have equations that explain how things move in the physical world, I think that very probably it's. I don't think maybe some experts can. I don't think you can trace it further back, but I think probably you're talking about the Middle Ages really. There, you're talking about quite well into the first after the end. About 10th century onwards, maybe you can't trace it much further back than that. I don't know. And and to like Galileo and his ideas, rather later than that. So the Galileo and his ideas of dropping things off the Tower of Pisa and letting things roll down the inclined slopes and so on. So when you go back to the time of the Buddha, there was nobody in the entire world doing experiments like that. There was nobody trying to roll things down and an inclined slope and try and time it, or try and drop things and see if two things of different weights land on the ground at the same time. And nobody in the entire world had ever thought of doing a thing like that. So at the time of the Buddha, if you start thinking that these ideas, so you can read these ideas in the sutras and you can't start thinking, it's sort of the ideas that if we were investigating them now, we would do physics. But back then, they weren't looking at things in that way. And so when it starts talking about seasons and various things leading to other things, and you can lots of things you can see without trying to understand it in a physics way. So you can see, for instance, that I'm going to die, and you see all other people are going to die. So that's very obvious, and you can see that things fall apart, and things get broken. You have things that something is very nice, and then it falls on the floor and it gets broken. You don't need to understand all the physics of how that works, and work out all the physical laws to understand things like that. And so karma is very much in that kind of area. And what's more, that the Buddha actually gave teachings about karma, of saying that we shouldn't actually try and make it into physics. And he was calling it one of the four imponderables. And he said, he, of course, he didn't have the ideas of physics, but if he was around nowadays, then a way of expressing what he was saying is, don't try and make karma into a law of physics. I think that would be a good way of presenting his teaching on the four imponderables to a modern audience. And so you've got this idea, so in the four imponderables, then he said actually that if you try and understand the details of how the karma comes about and about how you end up in the situation that you're in, if you try and work out all the details of that, then that's actually would drive you mad. It's just not possible to do that. And so then there is, it's kind of a little bit difficult. So we've got physics anyway. We can't get away from the fact that nowadays we have physics, and Buddhists are often very interested. For instance, the Dalai Lama is very interested in physics, and he's spoken to many famous physicists and had days and sort of talking to them and having long conversations with them about physics and trying to understand it very well. So that's the idea of, even within physics, you have these people. Some people think that someday we're going to have a theory of everything, and other people are much more skeptical about that and think, I don't think that's really going to happen. It's always going to be continually some things that we haven't quite understood yet. But even if you have the idea that at some point we will have a theory of everything, then within that it's totally recognised that you get chaos. Chaos theory is a kind of recent development in the last century, and so that's the idea that things are very sensitive, so sensitive to conditions that you can't actually predict what's going to happen. So for instance, we will never, even if we had a theory of everything and we could write down a single equation that explained everything in physics, it's never going to let us predict what the weather's going to be a week from now probably, or certainly a month from now, in all its details, like whether some particular rain shower is going to happen in some particular place on the 4th of January or whatever. There's probably never going to reach the point where we can do that sort of thing, because of the sensitivity to conditions. So karma fits within that framework as well. So you can never expect to do that for karma either. So I mean, if you can't even do it with weather, how can you possibly do it with this other area, this something that's far more subtle and difficult to see than the weather? So that's the, and then as well as that, we also have in physics. So we have two things in physics that leave open the possibility that even if you had a theory of everything, it wouldn't really explain everything. So we also have the idea in quantum mechanics where you have this curious thing that if you have a radioactive substance and you have a Geiger counter next to it and you get these clicks going click, 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 like that, very irregular clicks. There's no way to predict those clicks. There's no way to say, oh, well, I'm going to get one at this particular point in time. So that's built into quantum mechanics. And this is the idea that every time you get a click, that's a kind of observation. And if you look at the way that physics works in quantum mechanics, then you have they have these two elements to it. There's the equation with the superposition of states and Schrödinger's equation, and then you have the collapse of that when you make an observation. And then there's a big question, lots of different ideas about how those things relate to each other. So in the superposition of states, it has neither clicked or not clicked, your Geiger counter. So it's a superposition of both having clicked and not clicked. And then at some point you get this observation, and so it has to, at some point it has to collapse. The physics just says it's a superposition of many states. And then you have what they call this operator, which makes this observation, which collapses it into one of those states. And so quite how that works, there's lots of different ideas about that, but that's another area in physics where give you this little kind of chink where your theory of everything is not going to make so you know exactly what's going to happen in all possible respects. So and then I don't think there's anybody even trying to be the beginning of a theory to try to get an equation that's going to say what's going to happen after I die. And so if you have this idea that you have continuing awareness that continues into future lives, then no matter how good your theory of everything is, I don't think anybody really thinks that we're going to come up with some equation that's going to help us understand that in a way that we can actually say what's going to happen in your next life. And so anyway, the Buddha he taught a bit about that as well, and he said that if you try and trace back that, I think I might talk about that a little bit later, but you can't actually trace back to previous lives as well. That there's so yes. What I'll just talk a little bit briefly about it just now. So you do have the idea of the Buddhas that when you reach enlightenment, in a certain sense, you can see this kind of connection with these past lives. And previous, and you have the Jataka tales of the Buddha, of the stories of his previous lifetimes. And there, I think probably a way of understanding that is more like you've got this kind of the past and the present. They're much more fluid than we think. And there's much more connection between the distant past and the present than we actually realise. And it's sort of when you start getting to the end and you stop thinking in such a very linear way between the past and present, and you have to do that before you can really appreciate the workings of karma. You have to have dropped this linear thinking and this kind of fixed direction of time and space being spread out in like one point after another and after another after another in a very sort of ordered fashion. And things are much more interconnected than we realise. So you only really, and karma then is a very subtle teaching. Teachings about karma. It's all to do with interconnection of things, both in the present and the present with the very distant past. And the Buddha was teaching this interconnection is something that you can't truly understand by following the methods of physics. That it's never going to get you there, to truly understand how the past is interconnected with the present. So in this sense, then karma, is, in some ways, is far more subtle than physics. Physics is never going to get you there. And you've got to drop this idea of trying to make a theory of everything because karma is you can't do that. So you can have a theory of everything for our physical world, maybe, who knows, maybe there's some equation, maybe there isn't for this particular world we're in now, but to try and make that theory of everything continue to all future lives and all past lives and truly understand absolutely everything just through some equation or something. And so that's the, so now then where have we got to? So there's the, that's the, so then you've got the past and so you've got the idea. It's not a theory of everything, but it's oops, sorry, I'm just getting a bit. Let's see. That's probably a good time to pause for a minute or two. I think even though I'm in the middle of talking about this, I'm going to stop at this point, just because it's quite good to stop these to have not very long videos. So somewhat in the middle of this, but I'll just continue talking about this karma not being a law of physics in the next video.